Hello, everybody. So I've recently been castigated online for daring to challenge, an Oxford academic in zoology and environmental science on this issue of methane emissions and challenging a man who, by the way, is a vegan, so could have obviously no biases at all in this matter, and challenging his research that fails to adjust its statistics for the amount of carbon sequestered in the crops fed to livestock and the fact that this would obviously impact the carbon equivalent load of their methane emissions. So, what this video is going to be is this is going to be a deep dive into Joseph Poore's 2008 research paper entitled "Reducing Food's Environmental Impacts for Producers and Consumers." Authors J. Poore and T. Nemechek. Affiliation Department of Zoology, University of Oxford; School of Geography and Environment, University of Oxford; Agroscope, Agroecology and Environmental Research Division, LCA Research Group, Zurich, Switzerland. Okay, so here's the abstract. Food's environmental impacts are created by millions of diverse producers. To identify solutions that are effective under this heterogeneity, we consolidate data covering 5 environmental indicators, 38,700 farms and 1,600 processors, packaging types, and retailers. Impact can vary 50-fold among producers of the same product, creating substantial mitigation opportunities. However, mitigation is complicated by trade-offs, multiple ways for producers to achieve low impacts, and interactions throughout the supply chain. Producers have limits on how far they can reduce impacts. Most strikingly, impacts of lowest impact animal products typically exceed those of vegetable substitutes, providing new evidence of the importance of dietary change. Cumulatively, our findings support an approach where producers monitor their own impacts, flexibly meet environmental targets by choosing from multiple practices, and communicate their impacts to consumers. Also, crucially, in this research, I did sort of notice, I think, that he didn't ever pick up on the point that sort of vegetable and crop farming relies heavily on manures and compost, which is, I mean, a little like odd. There's kind of feedback loops between the two systems, which I mean, it's a rather unfortunate thing not to have noticed. In my humble opinion, as not an Oxford University researcher, but what have you. Okay, let's get into the meat of this. Main text. The current dietary and production practices feeding 7.6 billion people is degrading terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, depleting water resources, and driving climate change. It is particularly challenging to find solutions that are effective across the large and diverse range of producers that characterize the agricultural sector. More than 750 million farms produce in almost all the world's climates and soils, each using vastly different agronomic methods. Average farm sizes vary from zero point 0.5 hectares in Bangladesh to 3,000 hectares in Australia. Average mineral fertilizer use ranges from 1 kilogram of nitrogen per hectare in Uganda to 300 kilograms in China. And although 4 crops provide half of the world's food calories, more than 2 million distinct varieties are recorded in seed vaults. Further, products range from minimum to heavily processed and packaged, with 17 of every 100 kilogram of food produced transported internationally, increasing to 50 kg for nuts and 50 kg for oils. Previous studies have assessed aspects of this heterogeneity by using geospatial data sets, but global assessments using the inputs, outputs, and practices of actual producers have been limited by data. The recent rapid expansion of life cycle assessment (LCA) literature is providing this information by surveying producers around the world. LCA then uses models to translate producer data into environmental impacts with sufficient accuracy for most decision making. Today, efforts to consolidate these data or build new large-scale data sets have covered greenhouse gas emissions only, agriculture only, small numbers of products, and predominantly Western European producers, and have not corrected for important methodological differences between LCAs. Here we present a globally reconciled and methodologically harmonized database on the variation in foods' multiple impacts. Our results show the need for far-reaching changes in how food's environmental impacts are managed and communicated. Building the multi-indicator global database, we derived data from a comprehensive meta-analysis identifying 130 studies for potential inclusion, which was supplemented with additional data received from 139 authors. Studies were assessed against 11 criteria designed to standardize methodology, resulting in 570 suitable studies with a median reference year of 2010. The dataset covers approximately 38,700 commercially viable farms in 119 countries, and 40 products representing approximately 90% of global protein and calorie consumption. It covers 5 important environmental impact indicators: land use, fresh water withdrawals weighted by local water scarcity. I bet they talk about green water though, and GHG acidifying and eutrophifying emissions. For crops, yield represents output for a single harvest. Land use includes multiple cropping, up to 4 harvests per year, fallow uncultivated periods between crops, and economic allocation to crop co-products such as straw. This makes it a strong indicator from productivity and food security and yield. The system we assess begins with inputs, the initial effect of producer choice, and ends at retail, the point of consumer choice. For each study, we recorded the inventory of outputs and inputs, including fertilizer quantity and type, irrigation use, soil, and climatic conditions. Where data were not reported, for example, on climate, we used study coordinates and spatial data sets to fill gaps. We recorded environmental impacts at each stage of the supply chain. For GHG emissions, we further disaggregated the farm stage into 20 emission sources. We then used the inventory to recalculate all missing emissions. For nitrate leaching in aquaculture, we developed new models for this study. Studies included provide approximately 1,050 estimates of post-farm processes. To fill gaps in processing, packaging, or retail, we used additional meta-analyses of 153 studies providing 550 observations. Transport and losses were included from global data sets. Each observation was weighted by the share of national production it represents, each country by its share of global population production. We then used randomization to capture variance at all stages of the supply chain. We validated the global representativeness of our sample by comparing average and 90th percentile yields to Food and Agriculture Organization data, which reconcile to within plus or minus 10% for most crops. Using FAO food balance sheets, we scaled up our sample data. Total arable land and freshwater withdrawals reconcile to FAO estimates. Emissions from deforestation and agricultural methane fall within ranges of independent models. Okay, this is obviously the thing I'm majorly interested in, agricultural methane. Today's food supply chain creates approximately 30.7 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents, 26% of anthropogenic GHG emissions. A further 2.8 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalents, 5%, are caused by non-food agriculture and other drivers of deforestation. Food production creates, and when they say the food supply chain, by the way, that figure of 26%, yeah, seems likely to me in terms of carbon dioxide, sure. They're talking about everything, including ships, tractors, trucks, supply chain. Where does that end? The supermarket, that's where that ends. Powering supermarkets, infrastructure involved in that, packaging, processing. That's not very surprising when it's 26%. Actually, the minority of emissions actually occur on farms. And this fact is very much glossed over, I feel, in the subsequent paper, and the focus is very much on farms themselves within this piece of research, which is really rather misleading. And considering this weighting of CO2 being 5.8 times greater contributor to the greenhouse effect than atmospheric methane, adjusting for the disparity in each molecule's potential as a greenhouse gas. Adjusting for that, the greenhouse effect is 5.8 times greater with carbon dioxide than it is with methane. So this is sort of very much glossed over in the research, and this is very much an attack, or it seems like the focus is on farms themselves, which is a little unfortunate, I think, since he's already brought up this fact that 26% of global carbon dioxide emissions occur in the agricultural food chain, most of which has nothing to do with farms themselves. So moving on with that. Today's, where was I? Okay. Yeah, food production creates approximately 32% of global terrestrial acidification and 78% of eutrophication. These emissions can fundamentally alter the species composition of natural ecosystems, reducing biodiversity and ecological resilience. If the focus was more on these sorts of things like eutrophication, ecosystems, increasing biodiversity, and so on, yeah, I totally believe we should move towards more regenerative agricultural methods, sure. You know, I'm not against that at all. I'm very much for like organic farming and biodynamic farming and regenerative ag. I'm very interested in those things. That seems like a very good thing to push for. Fine. But yeah, it's just these statistics, they're wrong. The statistics that are focused on are wrong. A lot of them. Today's agricultural system is also incredibly resource intensive, covering approximately 43% of the world's ice and desert-free land. Of this land, approximately 80% is for food, and 30% is for biofuels and textile crops, or is allocated to non-food uses such as wool and leather. Estimated that two-thirds of freshwater withdrawals are for irrigation. However, irrigation returns less water to rivers and groundwater than industrial and municipal uses. Returns less water to rivers and groundwater than industrial uses and municipal uses. Is that true? Well, if water is being used in heavy industry, I don't particularly want it returned to a river, and predominates in water scarce areas and times of the year. Now, the amount of water used, by the way, in agriculture is overwhelmingly used in crop production, but that's beside the point. Driving 90% to 95% of global scarcity weighted water use. And like, if this issue of water comes up in agriculture, it really always comes from people who've like never ever worked on a farm that farms livestock. Yeah, they got a little water trough, but when they're grazing grass, they get the green water, right? The water that's bound up in the grass itself. Silly, silly, silly. But where the hell was I? Otherwise, you'll end up believing that cows consume some absurd amount of like hundreds of gallons of water a day or whatever it is. This thing is. GHG emissions. Beef herd. Okay. This is a table here. Per protein thing. Okay, you might need to read this. So, okay, it's responsible for more eutrophication. That makes actually kind of a lot of sense. I'm not going to argue with the eutrophication thing. I'm just going to argue with the greenhouse gas thing. That's really the focus of this. What is it like? Our rice causes quite a lot of eutrophication, as do potatoes. That's olives. Tomatoes cause a huge amount of eutrophication. Oh dear. Acid eutrophication. I'm not going to deny those statistics. Those aren't my area of interest, as I said. Oh dear, soybean oil causes more greenhouse gas emissions than beef. And tomatoes cause more greenhouse gas emissions than beef, according to this table. Okay. Well, per kilogram anyway. Then again, we probably consume more kilograms of beef than we do. Okay, but whatever, moving on. Estimated global variation in GHG emissions, land use, terrestrial acidification, eutrophication, and scarcity weighted freshwater withdrawals within and between 40 major foods. N equals farm or regional inventories. Land use is area times year occupied, meters squared per year. Protein-rich products. Grains are also shown here, given they contribute 41% of global protein intake, despite lower protein content. Milks, starch-rich products. D, oils. E, vegetables. F, fruits. G, sugars. H, alcoholic beverages. 1 unit. Lovely Heineken. I should get money for this, shouldn't I? Having Heineken in the video. Or like lifetime supply of Heineken. We now group products by their primary dietary role and express impacts per unit of primary nutritional benefit. Immediately apparent is our results in the high variation in impacts among both producers and products and producers. 90% of GHG emissions of beef are 105 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per 100 gram of protein, and land use area multiplied by years occupied is 370 meters squared per year. These values are 12 and 50 times greater than 10th percentile dairy beef impacts, which we report separately, given that its production is tied to milk demand. 10th percentile GHG emissions and land use of dairy beef are then 36 and 6 times greater than those of peas. Except they're not, which is crucial. High variation within and between protein-rich products is also manifest in acidification, eutrophication, and water use. Within the major crops, wheat, maize, and rice, 90th percentile impacts are more than 3 times greater than 10th percentile impacts on all 5 indicators. Within major growing areas for these crops, the Australian wheat belt, the US corn belt, and the Yangtze River basin, land becomes less variable. Oh Christ, he even realizes that, like, land becomes less variable. Also, you can grow crops there then, and you don't have to farm livestock on it because you can't cultivate the ground for crops. And like on hilly areas, you must farm sheep because you wouldn't be able to plow it all up. Fucking absurd person. But we observe the same high levels of variation in all other indicators. Yeah. This variability, even among producers in similar geographic regions, implies substantial potential to reduce environmental impacts and enhance productivity in the food system. No, it doesn't. You don't understand. Like variability in what? Like topology and terrain. Like U.S. Corn Belt, Yangtze River Basin. Yeah, because they're huge areas with huge arable potential. That land use becomes less variable. It becomes more variable in other areas because soil type varies. Fuck's sake. For many products, impacts are skewed by producers with particularly high impacts. This creates opportunities for targeted mitigation, making immense problem more manageable. Is the problem even that immense to begin with, though? For beef originating from beefers, highest impact 25% of producers represent 56% of beefers' GHG emissions. Oh, well, all right, supposedly. And 61% of land use, an estimated 1.3 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalent, i.e. methane, I suppose is what it means by that. And largely 950 million hectares of land, primarily pasture. Across all products, 25% of producers contribute on average 53% of each product's environmental impact. For scarcity-weighted freshwater withdrawals, the skew is particularly pronounced, producing just 5% of the world's food calories, creates 40% of the environmental burden, approximately. He doesn't say if he's included green water in that, though. Scarcity weighted freshwater withdrawals. Don't know. Sometimes they just say water. It might be fresh water. What does green water count as? Is it fresh water? First step in mitigation is estimating producer impacts. Prior research has suggested that readily measurable proxies predict farm stage impacts, avoiding the need for detailed assessment. From our larger data sets, which include more practices and geographies than prior studies, we assess the predicted power of common proxies, including crop yield, nitrogen use efficiency, milk yield per cow, live weight gain, pasture area, and feed conversion ratios. Although most proxies significantly co-vary with impacts, they make poor predictors when used alone, explaining little of the variation among farms. R squared equals between 0 and 27% in 47 and 48 proxy impact combinations assessed. Prior research has also suggested using one impact indicator to predict others. And weakly positive and sometimes negative relationships between indicators. For similar products globally, correlations between indicators are low. R squared equals 0 to 30% in 26 of 32 impact combinations assessed. Pork, poultry meat, and milk show higher correlations between acidification and eutrophication, explained by the dominant role of manure in these impacts, but this does not generalize to other products or indicators. The same conclusion holds for farms in similar geographies or systems. Monitoring multiple impacts and avoiding proxy supports far better decisions. And yeah, I'm not really in favor of intensive pork, poultry production, and would like to see far more sustainable and regenerative practices involved in those sorts of agriculture, definitely. And yeah, reduce things like eutrophication from very intensive agriculture. I'm totally not against that at all. But we sort of wanted to have the greenhouse gas cake, I think, and this as well. It's like, well, no, you're lying. Or you're misleading people. And yeah, have the greenhouse gas cake and, well, make us eat it, basically. Quantifying impacts with the use of satellite or sensors data misses much of the variation among farm. Monitoring multiple impacts and avoiding proxies supports far better decisions and helps prevent harmful unintended consequences. However, two recent studies suggest that data on practices and geography required to quantify impacts must come directly from producers. The quantifying impacts of the use of satellites or sensors data You fucking know the satellite data on methane isn't complete, don't you? Oh dear. Not that it matters so much. Set and incentivize mitigation targets. When land use or emissions are low, we find trade-offs between indicators for many crops. This reflects diminishing marginal yield with increasing inputs as crops tend towards their maximum yields. For example, for already low emission North and European barley farms, halving land use can create GHG emissions per kilogram of grain by can increase GHG emissions per kilogram of grain by 2.5 times and acidification by 3.7 times. To explore trade-offs further, we pair observations from the same study location and year. That assess a practice change. Of the 9 changes assessed, only 2, changing from monoculture to diversified cropping and improving degraded pasture, there were statistically significant reductions in both land use and GHG emissions. Yeah, I grant you that, because soil acts as a carbon sink, which he does bring up briefly, but the thing is, a lot of the research in this area, they're focusing on soil carbon sequestration, and not the clear fact that rather a large amount of carbon is actually bound up in the plant itself as plant matter. And they obviously don't get all their carbon from the soil. They get a portion of it from the soil, as I understand it. But they photosynthesize and turn, oxygen and they turn carbon dioxide and glucose into ATP, is it, and oxygen, photosynthesis. So like they store their carbon in their plant mass. And they do release some carbon dioxide at night, and that's the other part of that's them respiring at night. But not as much as they store. So. Oh, where the hell was I? Okay, where's the thingy? Geography influences these trade-offs. For example, in the Australian wheat belt, where farmers practice low rainfall, low input farming, we find that both output per hectare and GHG emissions are in the bottom 15% globally. The environmental and social importance of different impacts also varies locally, given land scarcity, endemic biodiversity, and water quality, among other factors. Also, by the way, any amount of livestock farming is not responsible for affecting the land's ability to sequester carbon. I think that should also be made clear as well. The only form of agriculture that depletes the soil's ability to sequester carbon is crop farming, arable farming. Livestock farming just occurs on pasture land. So yeah, and also the practice of farming crops, as I understand it, like they actually add carbon into the soil also, because microorganisms take it as it's a complex system, and fungi also utilize carbon. So, but they don't take it in the form of carbon dioxide from plants. I'm not certain. I recently read Merlin Sheldrake's book. I'm not certain he actually covered the complex relationship there between mycorrhizal fungi and plants quite so much, though he did cover quite a lot of it. Okay, output per hectare and GHG emissions are in the bottom 15% globally. Environmental and social importance of different impacts also varies locally, given land scarcity, endemic biodiversity, and water quality, among other factors. Setting regional and sector-specific targets will help producers navigate trade-offs and make choices that align with local and global priorities. To meet these targets, policy might encourage widespread adoption of certain practices. However, the environmental outcomes of many practices, such as conservation agriculture, organic farming, and even integrated systems of best practice, are highly variable. Using our data sets, we can generalize these findings. To do this, we disaggregate each environmental indicator to its own sources or drivers. Consider practice change as a package of measures that targets one or more of these sources. If producers have different impact sources, the effects of practice will change will be variable. We find that sources of impact vary considerably among farms producing the same products. Priority areas for reducing impact for one farm may be immaterial for another. For example, measures to reduce direct nitrous oxide emissions from synthetic and organic fertilizer, such as biochar applications, are included in many mitigation estimates. However, for a third of global crop calorie production, these emissions represent less than 5% of farm stage GHGs. It may be the case that low impact farms have similar impact drivers. We again find variable sources of impact even for low impact farms. Reducing impacts means focusing on the different areas for different producers and by implication adopting different practices. Okay, that's brought up the table. This is the table with all the greenhouse gas emissions produced by wheat versus beef farms and just wheat and beef farms. Okay, so Australian grass-fed beef is mostly emissions from enteric fermentation. Brazil improved pasture. Pasture management, that I expect means clearing rainforest, and the other part is from slightly more than 50% is from enteric fermentation. Or would it be from enteric fermentation? Canada feedlot with implants. China constant dairy, mostly from enteric fermentation. But all that is offset by the carbon sequestered in the food they consume. So it doesn't make any difference at all. Farming that could be carbon negative also. So 10% and 90th percentile contributions. Shaded bars represent the distribution. For example, the 90th percentile contribution of organic fertilizer, N2O, to farm stage emissions is 16%. But for most wheat producers, the contribution is near 0%. Density is estimated using Gaussian kernel with bandwidth selection performed with biased cross-validation, C&D contributions of emission sources, for example, producers with below median GHG emissions. Oh, this is going to be hell to read. For this further, we use sensitivity analysis to decompose the variance in each product's impact into its sources. Numerous sources contribute to variance. Most notably for all crop calorie production globally, differences in fallow duration and multiple cropping drive 40% of the variance in land use. This is important. Most strategies to increase productivity are focused on increasing single crop yields, but for many producers, increasing crop intensity through the use of early maturing varieties, intercropping catch crops, and enhanced irrigation can provide more economically viable and trade-off free ways to boost productivity and reduce impacts. Geography plays a major role in this variation and affects the economic and environmental desirability of different practices. Really? However, at the heart of agriculture is changing site conditions to enhance productivity, such as liming, terracing, or installing drainage, meaning that statements on the importance of geography have limitations. Nevertheless, some impact sources stand out. We find that freshwater aquaculture ponds create 0 to 450 grams of methane per kilogram of live weight. For example, the only way they can create that methane is through digesting food, though, which is already sequestered carbon. Of this variation, the context, enteric fermentation in dairy cows creates approximately 30 to 400 grams per kilogram of live weight. Grams of methane, I guess, or emissions, as I'm describing carbon equivalent. I assume he means that. Well, it says enteric fermentation, so I assume, yeah, it must mean methane, surely. 30 to 400 grams? Like, what dairy cows have you been studying? Where? Like, that is a very wide degree of variance, isn't it? Some produce 30 grams of methane, some produce 400 grams of methane. Like big Holsteins, like Dutch dairy farms and whatnot. Those are already like kicking out 400 grams of methane, but like, was it Brahmin cattle in India? Probably wouldn't be. This variation, a third, is explained by temperature, which accelerates methanogenesis and net primary production. Improving aeration and limiting addition of surplus feed to ponds can abate these emissions, particularly important in warm countries. Further, for every kilogram Improving aeration and limiting addition of surplus feed to ponds. You've answered your own question. That's the fucked up bit. Well, he hasn't. I mean, like, it should be right there, staring him in the face. Like, well, it comes from their food. Like, but it comes from their food. Well, yes, that's the issue here, isn't it? Like, they couldn't get methane from any other source. A fish can't dig a coal mine and burn coal. It doesn't add anything into the environment that wasn't there already. It's like biodiesel. It's carbon neutral. In fact, like, because animals shit in the ground, like, some carbon is hence actually removed from the environment via sequestration initially with the food that they eat. Then quite a lot of carbon actually remains in their shit. That gets put back in the soil. It might be carbon negative for that reason, to some extent. I suspect it actually offsets the greenhouse gas emissions from things like tractors and the electricity used on farms, which is generated from fossil fuels. I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case, but I'd have to actually like do some real research and like craft an analysis of, using maths and so on, of the amount of carbon, if any, that ends up getting sequestered permanently in soil in animal dung. And that'd be a very involved process. I probably need like a JSTOR key or access, and I have to spend money like reading research papers. I don't have the money for that, so I'm not going to do it. I do it for like my project at Plumpton or something. My final year. Oh, where's the paper gone? Here we go. Of this wide range, sorry, for every kilogram of nitrogen applied to crops, between 60 to 100 grams is lost in reactive forms. Of this wide range, approximately 40% is explained by site conditions, including soil pH, temperature, and drainage. Okay, say so. Prior research has also found that the potential of soil to store carbon varies significantly with soil property, slope, and prior practice. Yeah, I mean, that is it's a very important point, frankly. That this issue of land degradation or degrading soils is really, really important because, and that's all done through arable farming, like plant agriculture. And that's like overly intensive practices, too much chemical fertilizer, too many pesticides, too many insecticides and fungicides and herbicides and whatnot. And yeah, the soil gets like sterilized basically and robbed of all life, and hence it can't sequester carbon. And yeah, that is a very important point. And really, like those sorts of practices, like that is really what's driving climate change, if anything. Does it have anything to do with animal agriculture? Not really, not at all. And like, so vegan activists will pick up on this, like saying, like, "Oh, look at the emissions from beef." Is like, I guess, misreported, and it's so horrible. And like, well, poor, like he's at least bringing up that point. That's not such a bad point to have made. But again, like saying like in the 26% of like global emissions thing caused by the agricultural supply chain, like that includes so much more than just farming. Yeah, and does he get into that? Not remotely. It's horrible. But there we go. And that doesn't approach the heavy industries involved, say like turning natural gas into nitrate fertilizer. No, nothing like that. No. And natural gas is methane. So, natural gas mining couldn't be emitting any methane, could it? It's ridiculous. However, some practice changes can be pursued across all producers. Methane from flooded rice, enteric methane from ruminants, and concentrate feed for pigs and poultry are sizable globally, representing 30% of food's GHG emissions. I bet it doesn't actually. No, it wouldn't. Of course it wouldn't. So, no, not at all. Like, that's just a lie. Like, does he like back that up with anything? Are material for all producers contributing at least 70% of farm stage emissions? What? Hang on. Methane from flooded rice, enteric methane from ruminants, concentrate feed for pigs and poultry, are sizable globally, representing 30% of food's GHG emissions, are material for all producers or taking carbon dioxide out of the mix, which is by far the more significant greenhouse gas by 5.8 times or so. Like, or has he done like a sneaky vegan trick there? Because like this is the sort of thing a vegan will do with a statistic. 30% of global greenhouse or food's greenhouse gas emissions. What if they're doing that by molecular weight? Think of that. They could be, or Poore could be, by mass of methane versus mass of carbon dioxide. Even though carbon dioxide is responsible for by far a greater share of the greenhouse effect, methane's contribution is relatively insignificant. I bet they're doing that. They do the same thing with soy crops. What they do is like, 90% of it goes to livestock anyway. It's 90% of 90%, 90% for livestock. Yeah, like, yeah, by mass. You see, like that doesn't matter. 47% of the crop's value is in soy oil for export, which gets turned into soy milk and tofu. Yeah, and transported to the West, where it's sold to soy-sucking vegan pricks who don't know anything about, who've seen too much Earthling Ed on YouTube. And by the way, like the initial boom of Amazon rainforest deforestation, it was with soy agriculture, and then beef farming increased in Brazil like way later as like an ancillary benefit, because it turned out there's a big export market for soy. I'm gonna actually just quickly go on a digression and Google Western soy consumption by decade. All right, Our World in Data. I like this website. Our World in Data. Get up data. Ho ho ho! Look at that! Oh my goodness me! So gone from this is when the big soy boom happened, wasn't it? 1980, slightly less than 100 million tons. 2018, it peaked at 350 million tons. Like, irrespective of the fact that soy agriculture in what was once the Amazon rainforest is thought to be largely fed to animals, yet the mass of the soy meal that's left over from soy oil production is, I calculated a statistic that 40%, 7% of the market value of the product, i.e. soy oil, the overwhelming majority of which is turned into soy products that are for human consumption. 40%, 7% of the market value of the crop comes from soy oil. 53% of it comes from soy meal, which is fed to livestock. I calculated that based on 2018 soy meal prices, I think, or 2019 soy meal and soy oil prices. However, what I suspect is that as the market for soy oil has become saturated due to overproduction, the price of soy oil has actually diminished and has come in line, more than likely, with soy meal. Do you see what I mean? Because produce more of something, price drops, right? Supply and demand. So, I suspect since 1980, this big soy milk, all that has been driving the cutting down of the Amazon rainforest and vegans they're responsible for that shit. Quite they want to divest themselves of responsibility for that by saying, it's just fed to livestock. It's fed to livestock. 90% of it is by mass. But they're growing it because of the lucrative export market to sell it to you people. So you're responsible for cutting down the Amazon rainforest, and destroying a very valuable carbon sink and replacing it with an inferior carbon sink, which are huge soy plantations. And Brazilian beef farmers, who in beef farming areas want to uh, acquire an ancillary benefit to this soy plantation with desecration of their a wonderful natural ecosystem, home to some unfathomably diverse array of plant and animal life. And you support the desecration of that via 47% market value of soy crop. And they do the same thing with crops here in the West. They just don't fucking understand anything at all about agriculture. And like this Joseph Poore guy, like maybe I'm not going to question him on zoology, possibly. I'm not going to question him on geography, possibly. But agriculture, like, why will you not understand that we attain benefit from crops by taking the parts of the crop that we can eat, which is usually about 10% of it, and we have to mostly feed the rest to animals to turn stuff that we can't break down in our bodies into food that we can consume. That is why we do this in agriculture as farmers. It's not like, oh, I just want to have some cows around and goats, and wake up at 4 a.m. to milk the fucking things. But I mean, it's like, oh, my father did it and his father before him, and like, no, it's because it doesn't suit the topology and the terrain to grow crops there very often. And very often, if the soil is right for it, guess what they will do? Grow crops there, probably, because it's lower input costs for greater reward, as Poore alluded to in his, because the input costs in dairy farming are often very, very high. Anyway, back to Poore. Oh, hang on. So a friend of mine just messaged me on Facebook. I'm going to just see what he wants in a minute. Okay, I've covered the major points that I want to watch. This has gone on for 42 minutes. No one's going to watch any more of this, I bet, if they got this far. Maybe I'll follow up if there's any demand for it. So thank you everyone for watching up to this point. By the way, I love you lots.